paper, you can take notes on that too. The other thing you could do is, you can take some notes on paper and then you could talk to somebody who's got that stuff still going, and get it from them. Don't freak out and stop listening to your laptop. Alright, we got about 15 minutes. I'm just going to make this difficult to cover, but do it. So, last year, I did a little bit of a different version of a topic paper. How many of you were at Georgetown last year on the translation topic? Few of you? Okay. I incorporated this thing about the big questions of transportation infrastructure. That was part of the introductory lecture. And I like the way that worked, and I think I'm going to do that again, and I think that this is a little bit better way of introducing the topic. So instead of trying to know what the topic is going to look like and just kind of tell you a lot of things about the topic, I'm going to try to get you thinking about the things that will influence where the topic goes. Because I can't tell you for sure what all the debates are going to be like in September, much less in January or April. But I can tell you what the questions I'm asking are, the questions that I have asked, and I can share some of the answers that I've already uncovered. But I'm hoping that you get introduced to some stuff that's super useful here. We've got people who know a lot about Latin America, and we have people who know almost nothing about it. We have people who know a lot about debate. We have people who are relative beginners, people who are just now to the class who haven't really debated that much yet. And so instead of just like telling you, all right, these are the counterpoints that will be read, these are the top value arguments that will be read, I want to instead try to get you thinking so that you can answer some of those questions for yourselves. Because I don't have all the answers. No one has all of the answers to that at this point in some, regardless of how much reading we've done. You're going to get a specific lecture about each of the countries starting tomorrow. Cuba, then Mexico, then Venezuela. So what I'm hoping to do is kind of set up those lecturers so that you all have the background knowledge so that you can really appreciate the specific details that you get from those lectures, so that you can understand kind of the themes of the topic, and you can understand, you have kind of a foundational knowledge about the topic. So keep pondering at this. I don't really have a visual for the first thing. So the topic, for those of you who don't know, is resolve the United States federal government should substantially increase its economic engagement toward Cuba, Mexico, or Venezuela. That is the topic. And I'm going to, the way this lecture is divided is just in a series of questions. The first question is, why are we debating this topic? Why are we debating this topic? This is the holdover from last year, which I think is interesting. So how many of you know how the high school debate topic is formed? Does anyone know? How did we, why is this the topic? Who got to pick this? Who got to pick it? Coach Strong, okay. Does anyone know the name of the organization that arranges the topic? The resolution page, sort of, that's not really.
NDCA?
Not the NDCA, I wish it was the NDCA, we would do a better job. Far back. The who? National Friends League is not National Friends League. No one ever knows this, it's pretty awesome. I usually should know that. Nice, the National Federation of High School. Okay, this is an organization that just is a governing organization for all high school activity. It doesn't really have anything to do with debate except that it picks the topic, which is strange. The topic, when I see a new topic, the first thing that I always ask is, well, why is this the thing we want? This had to be vetted through a topic committee composed of coaches and representatives from different leagues in different states across the country. Students, people on the faculty, I think, have attended that in the past or attended that this year. And so this topic had to make it through that vetting process. It had to be on the final ballot. It had to be on the initial ballot. It had to be liked by enough coaches throughout the country, and then to be one of the final two, and then it had to beat the other topics. So it was like, this is kind of a lot of vetting the topic has gone through, not necessarily by national circuit style people, some of that, but it's just, this is the thing that debate coaches across the United States think was the best topic available for this year, and I think that's kind of interesting. How many of you have read the topic paper that was written about Latin America? Some of you have. If you haven't, I would suggest reading it. It's not very long. It's actually extremely short. You can probably read it in about 15 minutes. This year's topic was written by a person named Darren Meyer from Mississippi, St. Andrews Episcopal. Do we have any Mississippians in here? I don't know if we do. Does anybody know who that is? Been judged by him before? You vaguely know who he is? He wrote a topic paper, and when you write a topic paper, you're trying to justify that your topic should be selected. So it's a pretty good way for you to initially understand, all right, well, what are the big controversies in this area? Why does someone think that this is a debatable topic, a timely topic, and stuff like that? What I realized, and what I don't think many of you realize, I didn't even really realize this until recently, that the NFHS has like a formal list of the things that go into a topic paper that make a good topic. And I wanted to share some of those with you. The first thing is that there must be several debatable resolutions under the topic. So the reason that is important is because when we make the topic, it's not just this resolution. And I will explain something a little bit later about the quote-unquote Latin America topic, even though that's sort of strange given what the resolution said. So that voters have a lot of choices. So there have to be several resolutions under the topic. The topic has to be timely, but it can't be so timely that it's going to run out before the end of the season's debates. That can be an issue. That might be an issue on this topic even. For some of the countries. The topic must be national or international in scope. It can't just affect a certain area or a certain group of people. It must be debatable for a wide range of students. So it's got to be understandable and debatable for novices, some of those of you who are attending your first debate institute. But it also has to be challenging and debatable for the very best debaters. The topic must facilitate high-quality debates for a full year without being repetitive. And there's a line in the notes that I think I'll just read verbatim, because I think it's good. A good debate topic is one that will be of value to debaters, providing exposure to divergent points of view, experience in analyzing significant current issues and problems, and the opportunity to develop analytical and problem-solving skills. Sounds good. There must be a wealth of material available on the topic, and kind of easily available to most students. There must be interest in the topic, especially among high school students, but also among judges and community members, so that there can be some interest generated in debate. And finally, there must be a balance between affirmative and negative ground. And as I go through the rest of this topic introduction, I want you to keep all of those things in mind, and I want you to think about, did the topic committee achieve success? Does this topic meet those standards? Is this topic timely? Is it debatable? Does it generate some interest? Do you think the ground is balanced? Just kind of think about that. I think it's an interesting way to think about a new topic. So here are the arguments that Darren Meyer proposed in the paper. Here, this is the Cliff's Notes version of the topic paper. So if you've read it, I kind of think these are the most important arguments. If you haven't read it, this is sort of substitute for that, but I still think you should read the whole thing. Number one, he says it hasn't been debated recently. Does anyone know the last time that high school students in the United States debated a topic about Latin America?
84.
84? Not quite, but pretty close. 1987 to 88. That topic was resolved that the United States government should adopt a policy to increase political stability in Latin America. So that was a long time ago. None of you were born then. A lot of your instructors were born then. Latin America hasn't really ever been debated in college. It was discussed a little bit in 1982 and 1983 when they debated about military intervention in the Western Hemisphere. And then it was debated a little bit, at least one of the countries was, in 99 and 2000 when there was a constructive engagement topic that included a bunch of countries, including Cuba. The rest of them were not in Latin America. So, I haven't really debated about Latin America. Number two, he says Latin America is in transition. So Latin America is transitioning from an area or a region of the world that was basically just a battlefield for proxy wars between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, into a region of the world that kind of has its own economic autonomy, it has its own interests, it has its own organizations, and it has growing regional power. It's kind of broken away from the days of the Cold War. Number three, he says Latin America is growing apart from the United States. Traditionally, the United States had very close relationships with Latin American nations, with a few notable exceptions. But lately, other countries, China, Russia, Japan, Iran, he didn't mention, I don't think, but it's also true, are expanding their influence in Latin America. Number four, he says Latin American economies are becoming more important. They're starting to drive global growth. A lot of Latin American countries are growing faster than any other nation in the world, or as a general grouping, Latin America is growing faster than the rest of the world. So they have increased economic importance in the WTO, in trade generally. And Finally, he says, socialist and left-leaning governments, of which there are very many in Latin America, are undergoing a transition away from kind of extreme socialism. They're starting to incorporate some elements of capitalism to fuel this economic growth. And so it's a good time for the United States to consider what role it will play in that transition. What do we think of his case? It's not bad, right? It's like pretty good. After listening to that, I could get on board with this. He also notes that Latin America is back on the national agenda, at least a little bit, after having been almost entirely ignored for many of the last 10 years. Since 2009, President Obama, who will be visiting here tomorrow, has visited Latin America 6 times, and Vice President Biden has visited 4 times. So it's starting to become a thing again. We're starting to see more written about Latin America. We're starting to see more attention paid to Latin America.
I can email you the videos
Meyer
if you
says,
want. Oh, thanks.
I'm not sure this is true, so I want to share this with you, and I'm kind of curious. I'll talk to some of you at the end whether you think this is true. Here's what Meyer says. He says, one benefit of a Latin America resolution is that novice debaters are likely to already possess a level of familiarity with some parts of the topic. For example, incoming debaters who paid even a cursory glance at CNN, the New York Times, or a major news magazine are likely to at least heard some about Cuba-U.S. relations, the drug-related violence that has engulfed Mexico, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and the prominence of the environment. Varsity debaters should find issues such as the rights of indigenous peoples, state versus non-state action, and deeper discussions of environmental issues of sufficient interest to generate educational and interesting debate. So that's his argument. I'm not sure if that's true. I'm not sure how many of you know that much about Latin America. How many of you think that before hearing this math for a few minutes, you could have named more than 6 countries that are in Latin America? How many of you could have named more than 10? Okay, how many of you could have named all of them? None of you could have done. So that's why we have chosen to debate the topic. It's timely. The voting populace thinks, all right, this is something worth debating. We haven't debated it in a long time. This generation of students needs a chance to debate about the future of Latin America. So this is the topic that we have. I think you should think about that as you start to think about the rest of this and did they do a good job? Is this accurate? This assessment of the topic accurate? Number 2, why is this the Latin America topic? For the map. So when somebody is like, what's the debate topic this year? I think most people's response is Latin America. That was the title of the topic paper. That's the label that the voting used. We've used that. I've heard a lot of people say that. But it's sort of weird because it's not really the Latin America topic. It's the Cuba, Venezuela, Mexico topic. So the question is, what is Latin America? And I intuitively knew what that meant, but reading a lot more about it, there's a lot more to defining Latin America than one would think. So Wikipedia, first place to look, just I want to know what is the simplest version of Latin America. Wikipedia says Latin America is a region of the Americas where Romance languages, i.e. those derived from Latin, hence Latin America, particularly Spanish and Portuguese, and sometimes French, are primarily spoken. But that's sort of simple, so if you look at this and it's okay, the countries here that speak Spanish, or Portuguese, maybe French. You can kind of identify. Black's Law Dictionary says it's Western Hemisphere designated member countries / areas where mainly Spanish or Portuguese is spoken. These include Mexico, Central America, except Belize, and South America, except French Guiana, and Suriname. Okay. I came across that several times. I was I don't understand why they're right there, right? There's Guiana, French Guiana, Suriname. They should fit. Belize is right there. You just can't see it. Just next to Guatemala. So why don't they count? Well, that's because under that definition, French doesn't count as Latin. It doesn't count as Romance language. I don't know why that would be true. Why would it count? So the list of countries that I found, these are the countries that I think could be considered Latin America. So it's Argentina. You don't need to write this down because you can find this on Wikipedia. Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, and as I'm saying these, you can find most of them. I can't get the whole thing. Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, French Guiana, Guadalupe, which is a French territory, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, Martinique, which is also French, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, Puerto Rico, which is a U.S. territory, St. Bartholomew, which I don't even know how to pronounce that, which is French, St. Martin, which is French, Uruguay, and Venezuela. Okay, we are not debating Latin America. That's a lot of countries. Right? We're really not debating U.S. policy for Latin America. We're debating U.S. policy for a very small part, Mexico, Cuba, Venezuela. The rest of that, that is not an affirmative on the topic of the rest of those countries. So, I also got to thinking, why do we call it Latin America? We have South America, we have North America. I think there's a lot of confusion about, does Latin America include South America? Is that different? Is there such a thing as Central America? Thinking about those definitions, then I realized that those definitions are totally made up. And we're seeking the answer to this, and I was trying to come up with a trivia question that would name all the countries, and I was like, wow, it is kind of silly how dedicated we are to these labels. So those of you that are into critique kind of things, if you go to the lecture page on the wiki, there is a document, and I have to figure out how to make this not full screen. There we go. There's a document with some cards in it. I think it would be easier for you to just pull up the cards on your own computer than to read them off here. I'm not sure. Can you read that? Conservative that. You can get the general idea there. So it turns out that the term Latin America wasn't used at all really until the 1850s, and it didn't become a prominent part of the lexicon until the mid-1900s. So 1948, the UN used it for the first time, and it's kind of only over the last 50 or 60 years that the term Latin America has even been a thing. If you had grown up in the early 1900s, you might not know what Latin America was because it didn't really exist. So this first piece of evidence from Thomas Holloway is in an article in a book that he wrote. The article is called Latin America, What's in a Name? And I'll give you a chance to read that for a minute. And I'm going to emphasize a couple of the parts of this evidence. If you get ahead of me, you've already read this evidence, go ahead and read the next one. Under the Latin America. So Holloway, says, by its historical and intellectual origins, the term Latin America privileges those groups who descend from Latin peoples, meaning Spain and Portugal. And there's this weird, he even says, ironically, I still don't understand this. The French-speaking people who speak a Romance language, I don't understand who knows why French does not count. There's some stuff about that in the book that's the next level. But by another set of criteria, what is now called Latin America, so that's, remember the map, flip back over to the map, this whole part of the world that we call Latin America might be subdivided into those regions where the indigenous heritage is strong and native identity has reemerged to claim political space, especially in Mesoamerica, and the Andean region, Afro-Latin America, especially the Caribbean, much of Brazil, and Euro-Latin America, which is, which relative to massive immigration transformed the demographic and cultural makeup of southern Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina. In other words, Latin America as a term ignores or claims dominance over other cultures in the region, which have recently come to reassert their distinctive traditions. And there are a lot of people in this area of the world that we call Latin America who do not speak a language like Spanish or Portuguese. There are a lot of people in this region of the world who do not identify themselves as Latin Americans. It's really just the West that has defined this region as Latin America because we want to prioritize the European descendancy of that region. So we want to call this area, this is where the Spanish settled, this is where the Portuguese settled, as opposed to Anglo-America, which is the part of America where the Germans and the British and the white people settled, which is the United States of America and Canada. So the distinction between Anglo-America and Latin America is really kind of arbitrary and very political. And Holloway says that that relationship, that definition, the possible definition, is a product of colonialism and of the subjugation of those indigenous people. The next card is from a book called The Idea of Latin America, which is really good, really interesting, by this professor at Duke. This is from the beginning of the book. I'll give you a chance to read this card briefly. He takes the argument, Walter Mignolo, or however you pronounce that, takes the argument a step further. He says that this whole obsession with defining Latin America, and defining Latin America as distinct from North America, South America, Central America, all of the continental divisions that we rely on and we care so much about, are really constructions. And I think we forget that sometimes. The world didn't just get created with America, Latin America, Europe, and whatever. That's all stuff that cartographers and scientists and explorers and all that from the West decided the world looked like. That's a purely subjective way to define the way the world is separated. There's no need to say that this group of countries is Latin America. Like, why? It's not natural. It's not like it's just always been Latin America. It's their way to be discovered. It's something that was created by Europeans. And he says that what he wants to write about in this part is not about Latin America, but how the idea of Latin America came about, and how it would be possible, he thinks, to uncouple the idea of Latin America from the land that we currently define as Latin America. And I think this is a really good springboard for those of you that are interested in critical theory, those of you that are interested in social justice and in identity politics and that kind of thing, to start thinking about the Latin America topic. Why do we call this the Latin America topic? Why does so much evidence speak about U.S.-Latin American relations, as if that was one cohesive whole of Spanish and Portuguese-speaking people who have a shared political identity? And he challenges readers to start thinking differently about the relationship between indigenous people, immigrants, slaves, and the whole historical construction of this part of the world in new ways. And it's very interesting. You can buy it on the Kindle for like $20 or something. The print version is a lot more expensive. But if you can get a copy of this book, it's also available in like a scanned version, so it's difficult to cut. But you can read it. It's not that long. It's like 100 and some pages, 180 pages. If you just Google it, because Mignolo will put it on like a personal website or something. So that brings me to question number 3. It's the Latin America topic, but why did we select Cuba, Mexico, and Venezuela? Why are those 3 countries? There were a bunch of other countries discussed in the topic here. Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, and then the 3 that got picked were all mentioned. So I don't know for sure why these 3 were selected. I'm sure that different people had a variety of reasons for supporting them. But Cuba seems pretty obvious. It's the most notable example of controversial U.S. policy toward Latin America, probably. So here's Cuba. It's a nation with a long history of containment by the United States. And it's a nation that is very relevant to a lot of Americans. So a lot of people in America know people from Cuba. There are a lot of Cubans who now live in the United States. There's a lot of cultural connection. So it's probably, if we're going to debate Latin America, it seems like we've got to talk about Cuba. The other thing about Cuba is that our policies toward Cuba shape the way that a lot of other nations in this region feel about the United States. So the embargo, hardline stance by the United States is one of the reasons, as the topic paper said, that there's been some drift between the United States and them. So then what next? Okay, well, Venezuela also makes sense. It's not really an enemy, but it's sort of an adversarial state. It's a huge ally of Cuba. It's an ally of Russia. It's an ally of Iran, a little bit. It's one of the countries that if you were making a list of all the countries in the world that the United States doesn't have very good relations with, that the United States is in sort of an adversarial relationship with, it would be on the list. It's not like the number one or anything, but it's up there. Venezuela also is very active and vocal about talking about the United States. They seem to care a lot about the United States, so we, in turn, care a lot about them. That would make sense. Venezuela's done here. So then the last one, Mexico. This one's weird. Because Mexico is probably the United States' closest ally in Latin America. There are a bunch of issues that the United States and Mexico are working on, but we're cooperating with Mexico. They're one of our biggest allies, one of our biggest trading partners. So we're working on border security, we're working on immigration, we're working on drug trafficking, trade, all those kinds of issues. It's a little weird. So we think about, here are the similarities between those three countries. And you should listen for this in the top lectures. Number one is they're obviously all in Latin America. They were all at one time Spanish colonies. They're all overwhelmingly Spanish speaking. They're all overwhelmingly Catholic. They all have strong cultural connections to the United States. Baseball is really big in all three countries. I looked this up just because I was curious. 113 players from Mexico played Major League Baseball, 286 from Venezuela. In Cuba, it's impossible to count. There were a ton before the embargo, many hundreds, but there was about 70 Cuban baseball players who defected and played in Major League Baseball since the embargo. All three countries have really high literacy rates. The lowest is 91%. That's Mexico, I think. 93 is Venezuela, 99.8 or something like that is Cuba. Best in the world. All three have abundant energy resources, mostly oil. All three have left-leaning governments and a history of leftist politics. And all three have had relatively recent power transitions. So in Cuba, Raul Castro took over in 2008. That's he had the most tenure of the three. In Mexico, Nieto took over in 2012, just last year. In Venezuela, Maduro just took over in April. But what about the differences? So I already mentioned that Mexico is an ally, whereas Cuba is an enemy, and Venezuela is basically almost all the way there. Mexico and Venezuela are federal republics. They're pretty democratic. It's imperfect democracies, whereas Cuba is a communist country. Mexico is one of the U.S.'s biggest trading partners. It's our third largest trading partner. Venezuela is 14th, which surprised me. It's more than I would have thought. But Cuba is not on the list. The United States doesn't trade very much with Cuba because of the embargo. So as you are listening to the specific topic lectures, I want you to listen for similarities and differences, because those similarities and differences will determine how you're going to craft your generic ground against these different affirmatives. It's also going to help you choose an affirmative, because you'll know kind of which general negative themes apply to the different affirmatives. I would imagine that all of the lectures are going to have a large historical component, and you might think at first, like, oh, this is boring, this is like history class. But I would encourage you to not only pay close attention to that part, but also to think about why the history that you're learning is important and how it has shaped the relationships between the United States and the country in question, and how the relationships between the different countries have diverged. So why is Mexico the ally, whereas Cuba is the enemy? Why is Venezuela stuck in the middle and crazy? And I would encourage you to do a little bit of reading even before you hear those lectures. So read a little bit about Cuba, read a chronology of major events, read the Wikipedia page about Cuba, before the Cuban lecture, the same about Mexico and Venezuela, just so that it's a lot of names, and it's a lot of dates, and it's a lot of history, but that stuff's really important. And camp is a good opportunity for you to learn it. Fourth question, what is engagement? And what is it not? I think more importantly, what is it not? So there's a card in the T file from Sudinger that I think has the shortest definition. It says engagement, when it is described at all, is usually defined by what it is not, namely, not containment, isolation, punishment, or military oppression. We flip back over to the engagement definition. Put 3 engagement definitions, Johnston and 2 cards from Resnick, one of which is really long. We're not going to have a lot of time to go into a lot of depth on these, but I would encourage you to start your topicality highlighting and just kind of learning by reading these cards. I think these are the best ones that give you, they're not necessarily the best definitions for purposes of debate, although I think they're good, but they definitely provide the best background, and they seem like the cards that would best communicate to you what engagement is. So Johnston says that engagement is distinct from containment. So in contrast to containment, engagement seeks neither to limit, constrain, or delay increases in the target country's power, nor prevent the development of influence, blah, 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 blah. So the simplest version is just engagement is a friendly, proactive, positive policy, whereas containment is a negative policy oriented at stopping the nation. So engagement, the goal of engagement is to convince another country through trade or through cooperation of some other kind, I'll talk about that in a minute, to change its behavior such that it behaves in a way that the nation acting toward it wants. The United States engages with Venezuela to try to change Venezuela's behavior, not by making Venezuela change, but by encouraging Venezuela to change. This really long card from Resnick I think is really good. And it distinguishes engagement from not just containment, but also appeasement, which is just like giving the other country whatever they want, and isolation, which is just ignoring the other country. So it's kind of hard to define engagement, but it's pretty easy to define engagement by what it isn't. So it's not containment, it's not trying to contain the country, it's not trying to contain Cuba. It's not appeasement, it's not just like giving Cuba everything that it wants. It's not isolation, which is just ignoring Cuba. The last Resnick card is a pretty good explanation of why the word engagement is often defined poorly. And I think it's very strong for the argument that a broad definition of engagement is kind of meaningless. Because engagement can mean anything. You're always engaging another country. You can launch a nuclear weapon at Russia, that's engagement with Russia. You're engaging it with nuclear weapons. So in order for this term engagement to be meaningful, it has to be different than that. It has to mean something. And there's a ton of evidence in your topicality starter file that just goes into more detail about the different kinds of engagement and different things that may or may not be engagement. Number 5. Last question. What is economic engagement? And what is it not? Probably more important. What is it not? So the resolution could have just said engagement. It could have said the United States federal government should substantially increase its engagement with Cuba, Mexico, Venezuela. But it didn't. It could have said constructive engagement, which is what the college topic used in 1999. It could have said some other modifier for engagement, but it chose, the chosen wording was economic engagement. So the question is, why was that included in the topic? And what does it mean? The first piece of evidence, which there are versions of in the starter set, this is a slightly different cutting because I think it includes more of the, it's better for just explaining what economic engagement is than as an actual card. Collar and Kastner say economic engagement is a policy of deliberately expanding economic ties with an adversary in order to change the behavior of the target state and improve bilateral political relations. I think that's the best definition I've seen for economic engagement. The thing that I noticed right away when I started doing this research was the word adversary. That's a weird word to put in this topic. Why is it a weird word to put in this topic? Mexico. How is any Mexico at topic? They're not an adversary, so how can we economically engage with Mexico? I'm not sure how that's going to play out. I think since the resolution specifies Mexico, it would be a pretty silly argument to say there are no topical Mexico acts because they're not an adversary. But it's an interesting instance where I think that some of the better definitions of the term in the resolution don't necessarily correspond well with the rest of the wording of the resolution. Colin and Castro go on to distinguish between two kinds of engagement. Let's try to fit all this. I can't, but I'm close. Scholars have usefully distinguished between two types of economic engagement: conditional policies that require an explicit quid pro quo on the part of the target country, and policies that are unconditional. This is quite important. I wanted to make sure I got here with enough time. So there is some dispute. There's not really much dispute. At the beginning of doing this research, I think people thought that there was more debate about whether economic engagement could be conditional or unconditional. So what do I mean by conditional or unconditional? Conditional engagement would be if I said, E-Man, I will give you $10 every day you come to lab on the condition that you arrive on time. That would be a conditional engagement. I would be trying to change E-Man, my adversary's behavior, by encouraging him to change his behavior in a way that I want, and probably improving our relationship. I could alternatively, unconditionally, economically engage him by saying, E-Man, I'd love for you to show up on lab on time, but whatever, $10 every day. Both of those are forms of economic engagement, because both intend to change the target's behavior. It's just a question of which is the better strategy. So I think affirmatives could be either one. They can either just unconditionally engage. We can say, Cuba, Mexico, Venezuela, here's some economic stuff. Or they can say, Cuba, Mexico, Venezuela, here's some economic stuff on the condition that, ... And that condition can be basically anything. So we could remove some restrictions on Cuba in exchange for them releasing a prisoner. We could, provide Mexico with some assistance as long as they agree to boost enforcement of the border. We could cooperate with Venezuela on oil on the condition that they improve their human rights practices. All sorts of things. This is interesting on this topic because this creates the possibility of basically a conditioned counterplan on the affirmative, which then raises the question of, well, how does the negative respond? The negative could theoretically respond with the counterplan that does it unconditional. And one of the things that the higher groups at the camp will work on is having those debates and simulating those debates, because those involve both substantive arguments about the topic. They involve arguments about which strategy is better. Will Venezuela, Cuba, Mexico agree to those terms? Are there different terms that should be used? A lot of interesting stuff. But they also involve debate theory constructs about competition and permutations and whether those counterplans are competitive. So as you learn about the different countries, keep that in mind. Keep in mind, what about conditioning some of our assistance? What about not conditioning some of our assistance? Which is a better method for this particular country or for this particular form of engagement? The next card from Haas is, I think, the best one that lists, there's some other ones that do a good job of listing other things, but it lists some of the other adjectives that could have been used, but were not. So I already said constructive. That's a pretty broad term. That's one that the college folks know a lot about. But some of the other adjectives that could have been selected, political engagement could have been selected. Economic engagement seems different than political. Diplomatic engagement could have been selected. Diplomatic engagement is different than economic engagement. Military engagement could have been selected. But military engagement is distinct from economic engagement. Cultural engagement could have been selected. The cultural engagement is distinct from economic engagement. What I have found, I think this is borne out by the top tally files, that there's a lot of gray about which category a certain thing belongs to. Because obviously these categories are just made up. They're not like, there's no official definition of it. So scholars will define the different kinds of engagement in different ways. And the reason that you need to understand that is that as you're thinking about affirmatives, you have to think about, can we defend, when we're affirmative, that this is economic engagement? Both for topicality reasons, but also for counterplans. Because maybe it would be better not to economically engage with one of these countries, but to instead diplomatically engage, or to instead politically engage, or culturally engage. So this stuff gives the negative quite a bit of ground. Gives the negative some strong topicality ground, affirmative is going to have to come up with some good, broader definitions of economic engagement. They're going to have a good reason why their particular kind of engagement should be included on the topic. But it also gives the negative a lot of counterplans. I think there will be a lot of counterplans on that. Both having to do with condition versus not condition, and having to do with the kind of engagement that is covered. So some other things that are sort of discussed in these items, but discussed in other items as well, is who do you have to engage? Who does the United States have to engage? And that question is also sort of a question of the word toward, which I'm not sure how that's going to play out. I think a lot of people have a lot of interesting ideas about what that might mean. So the resolution doesn't say with or to, it says toward, which might mean that the nation that we're acting toward, Cuba or Mexico or Venezuela or whatever, doesn't have to be the only thing we act toward, or even the thing that we act with. We might want to engage with, say, Brazil to put pressure on Venezuela or to offer assistance to Venezuela. We might want to work together with the Bahamas and some of the other countries in the Caribbean to collaborate with assistance for Cuba on oil spill. I have no idea whether those things will become affirmatives that people think are topical or affirmatives that no one reads because everyone thinks they're topical. But I think people will definitely push the limits of the word toward. So you need to start thinking about what does that mean? What are some different creative ways that people are talking about that? This is one example from the previous lecture. We're talking to other people to generate some ideas. Because this is a word that I haven't seen in a topic before. Seems like the definitions are very broad. So a lot of you are going to have really creative ideas. Now I would make a note of those when your friend has a creative idea about toward. Because my guess is that in the fall or even next spring, they're going to have a nice new affirmative that's based on this idea they had at camp about how to interpret the word toward. The related question, of course, is does it have to be with the government? So does engagement have to be with, like, Castro or with Maduro or whatever? I can't answer that either. That's debatable. Cooperation might be able to be extended, or engagement could be extended toward civil society groups, toward rebel groups, like opposition to the government kind of things. So like local or subnational governments in those countries, even to like private businesses, you can engage with a business. What's up?
So if we could do it towards like non-governmental groups, that we wanted to do economic engagement to a group that would overthrow the government.
Yep. I think people will play with that. I think there will be a whole set of affirmatives that are hardline. That there's going to be a lot of affirmatives, obviously, on first look. Like, okay, well, this topic is to like help these three countries to be nice to them. I think there are a whole host of affirmatives that will do the opposite. They will engage the country to undermine their regime, undermine their government. I think there will be some affirmatives that play with the conditional nature of engagement and say, here's an offer of Venezuela, and then read evidence that Venezuela would reject that offer, and that would make Venezuela look bad. And that would hurt Venezuela's credibility. That could be an advantage. One thing that has proven true more than anything else is that people will try everything to skirt the boundaries of the topic. And so camp is a great opportunity to start thinking about some of those things. A lot of these aren't good at. They're just strategic because they avoid the stuff that everyone else has been preparing in the whole summer and into the fall. So on domestic topics, people read international affirmative. People read affirmatives that don't really do the verb in the resolution. People read asked to like make something, do their fiat or whatever. There's all these things that every year there's somebody or many somebodies who read affirmatives which are kind of silly or skirt the boundaries of the topic. But I think you should start thinking about what those could be during the summer. Because even if you don't feel like you want to read something like that, which I wouldn't want to read a lot of them, some of them, you're going to have to be negative. There's also a question about whether the engagement has to be done by any particular branch of the government, and whether it needs to be very visible. So, doing some Cuba research, it's very interesting how much authority the president, and even not the president, but the rest of the executive branch has, to engage with Cuba without Congress doing anything. There's a lot of evidence that engagement can be done without any fanfare or hoopla. So the Treasury Department or some of the other cabinet level departments could easily start to do some engagement without anyone really knowing. They don't have to announce it. They can just make minor changes to certain rules or agency rules, administrative rules. And I think that will be fertile ground for both affirmatives and counterpoints. In the same way that conditional, unconditional will be economic, non-economic will be ground for both topicality and counterpoint. Whether it has to be positive, so I mean, I'm pretty sure that it has to be positive, that the offer of engagement can't be like something negative to the country, but like it can't be economic sanction. You can't say the United States should substantially increase its economic engagement with Venezuela by placing a trade embargo on Venezuela. But people will read that too, because there are some, because of the vagueness of the term engagement and the differences in definitions, people will find evidence, and I've already seen that evidence, that negative kind of coercive actions are forms of engagement. I think that's a tougher sell on topicality, but it's obviously strategic, because it steals the typical or traditional negative ground, which is being hardline is good. And then the final thing under here, I had to skip some things that we'll return to in another lecture. What form does the engagement have to be? And how interactive does the engagement have to be? So there's a whole host of Cuba affirmative that will just change some small administrative rule that allows some more interaction with Cuba to happen. There are also a lot of like administrative changes that can be made with Cuba that are bigger, but yet still not really sure if economic engagement. So we could take Cuba off the terrorism list. It's silly that Cuba is still on the terrorism list. We could negotiate to get Guantanamo back to Cuba. We could negotiate to allow baseball players or any other profession travel ability to the United States. We could expand travel in any particular area. The question is how many of those things are really economic? And so one thing I want you to think about as you hear the other topic lectures is what does economic mean? And how does the word economic relate to the things that I'm learning about? So is it really economic assistance to take Cuba off the terror list? What would be the reason that it would be? What would be economic if the United States allowed more travel between the United States and Cuba? Is that economic? If it's not economic, what else is it? What is the distinguishing characteristic of economic? There are a bunch of cards in the topicality file that define the term economic. And I would start to read those. That would be one of the places that I would start reading the topicality file. And I would start to think about, what is